Well, I'm showing 2:02 here on the East Coast, so we will go ahead and get started, knowing that there are a couple folks who will probably join us throughout this beginning portion. So we'll go ahead and get started with a few housekeeping notes. First of all, welcome to everyone, and thank you for being part of this webinar on philanthropy's role in cross-sector leadership. My name is Kristen Campbell, and I am Executive Director of PACE, Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. And I want to start by appreciating our partners in this webinar, the Presidio Institute. A couple of quick notes of housekeeping today. First of all, this session is being recorded, so we will make the video archive available after the webinar today, so you can come back to it for future reference or share it with any of your colleagues who weren't able to be here today. Secondly, some folks have started to take advantage of the chat feature on your left-hand side. At any time, if you want to make any sort of comment or reaction to what's happening in the discussion, or pose a question to our panelists and presenters, I encourage you to do that. In the past, on some of our webinars, folks have gotten really engaged and interactive with each other and sharing links and resources and comments and presentation materials. And so I definitely encourage you to utilize that feature. And in addition to the video of this webinar, we will make the transcript of the chat available for download as well. And then finally, if you are joining us as an attendee today, by default, your microphone should be muted, but we have reserved a significant portion of our time today to just be in discussion with each other. So when you are ready to engage and speak, feel free to unmute yourself and we can hear you as part of the discussion as well. Or again, if you don't wish to speak up, you can type a comment or a question in the chat box and we will make sure that we're keeping a close eye on monitoring that. With that, I'd love to share a brief piece of context about why we're here today. PACE, as a learning collaborative of foundations and funders, has a shared belief. And that shared belief is that America will be stronger, more productive, more healthy, and more resilient if democracy is strong and the office of citizen is treated as central to how it functions. But for that vision or belief to really be realized, it means that all of us that have a stake in democracy have to come together. Every institution that believes in the process of democracy really needs to be engaged in part of that process. And spoiler alert, that is all of us. That's business, that's academia and education, it's nonprofits, it's philanthropy, it's government, state, local, and federal. So we really all have to be part of creating the democracy that we want to live in and the communities that we want to live in. That said, as a philanthropic learning collaborative, we understand that philanthropy has a unique role to play in that collaboration and that we bring unique aspects of leadership to the table when we're talking about collaborations and partnerships. This concept of cross-sector collaboration and cross-sector leadership has really been gaining momentum in the last few years, thanks in large part to some folks on this webinar today. But one thing that we've realized is that the implementation of that vision can still be a little bit tricky for folks. So that was one of the reasons that we wanted to convene this webinar today and really partner with one of the institutions that's leading this challenge and helping institutions of all types, shapes, sizes, and structures go on this journey of cross-sector leadership, and that's the Presidio Institute. We also wanted to highlight the work of some philanthropic professionals who have unique and diverse backgrounds and have been going on this journey themselves to tell some of the stories about their experiences, what they've learned from their backgrounds in the nonprofit, government, and business sectors, and what they're also learning and how they're bringing those concepts into their current roles in the philanthropic sector as well. So what we're going to do today is I'm about to turn it over to my colleague and friend David Smith, who's going to give us a little bit more of an introduction about series of cross-sector leadership and what we're going to accomplish today. Then we're going to have 3 brilliant program officers from representing foundations around the country to share their stories and experiences. And then we've reserved about half of our time today to really engage in discussion with you all. So with that, I'd love to, again, introduce my friend and my colleague, David Smith, Managing Director of the Presidio Institute. Dave, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Want to thank you, certainly thank PACE for the partnership here, and thank you for our panelists and fellow alumni who will be introducing momentarily, who really will be the experts in this conversation. A brief introduction of the Presidio Institute. We are an initiative of the Presidio Trust, which is the federal agency that stewards the national park land that surrounds and overlooks the Golden Gate Bridge. We are an initiative of the Trust that has really been focusing on how do we create positive impact beyond the walls of the Presidio and across the country. And so we focus on fostering collaboration among leaders of corporate, nonprofit, government, academia, philanthropy, and other sectors to really make meaningful impact in the world. We deliver programs and convene events that connect, that equip champions of change who have the ability to be able to tackle complex challenges through collaboration. And we really try to inspire these leaders to work across boundaries, to include the missing voice, and to take bold action. In short, really to lead in the 21st century. And one of the main ways that we do this is through our Fellows Program. And so the Presidio Institute Fellows Program, which is now in its 3rd year, and we're actually about to launch our applications for the 4th year moving forward, originally was called the Cross-Sector Leadership Fellows Program, and its focus is trying to build a cohort of leaders and actually support a cohort of leaders who have been leading in this space that has often felt like a lonely journey. Many people who have been taking in their own careers, navigating paths of multiple sectors, or have been leading in a place where their organization needs to partner with other organizations in different sectors and leading in a place where they don't necessarily have authority and really have to learn how to be adaptive in that space and be able to lead these collaborations. And so what we've identified is that this is a place where, we have great academic institutions that teach business leaders how to be business leaders. We have academic institutions that teach nonprofit leaders how to be nonprofit leaders, and philanthropic leaders to be philanthropic leaders, and government leaders to be government leaders. But there's not a lot at the intersection of these. And so what the Presidio Institute has stepped forward to do is to try to create some programming and rally others around this concept. And we see a lot of the principles of cross-sector leadership breaking down in 3 major buckets. And there's more information of this on our website as well. But these buckets are building teams, solving problems, and achieving impact. And these are really the skill sets that our Fellows Program, as well as other boot camps and intensives that we offer, focus on. So when you're thinking about building teams, particularly in a cross-sector lens, you're thinking about how do you develop trust? How do you manage power dynamics and conflict? How do you foster an innovation culture? When you're thinking about solving problems, you need to think about the impact on the people that you're trying to solve the problem with. So taking a human-centered design and really empathetic approach. How do you take a systems approach to understand that our systems are set up to deliver the results that they deliver? How do we adjust that system if we're trying to achieve different results? How do we define the result and use data to ultimately define the result we're trying to achieve? And then finally, in the achieving impact, it's how do we use leverage points? How do we think about public policy and capital flows and movements and citizen action? How do we align motivations and values of different stakeholders? And then finally, how do we share knowledge and learning across not just those involved in the collaboration, but across the country and across the world? And so this is really the approach that we help champion, and have been thrilled to work very closely with a number of philanthropic organizations that have either been partners in this or have actually had fellows go through this program. And I'll introduce a few of them in just a minute. But before we get started on that, I wanted to kind of turn to a couple polling questions for us to understand from the perspective of the attendees here, a little more about your own experience and perception of cross-sector leadership. So the first question here is actually going to be on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being novice, 5 being expert, how well developed in your own personal understanding is your own personal understanding and practice of cross-sector leadership? And so you should be able, those that are online should be able to vote immediately, and we can actually see the live results here. So I'll give you a few more seconds to get your votes in. It feels like we're getting a wonderful bell curve. This seems to be, it's skewing a little bit on one side, but one bold person has gone out there with a 5 and is an expert. So I'm sure we've, I was going to call out who I imagine that person would be, but we'll go ahead and keep going with these other questions. But so what we have is about 34% saying 2, about 47% saying 3, about 16%. So this is great. This means, and to be honest, when we actually ask this question of a lot of our fellows who have been steeped in the work of cross-sector leaderships for a decade or more, it ends up actually looking pretty similar. Maybe we'll have a few more 4s, but then by the end of the program, many people are saying, I'm actually still in the learning process and probably fall around the 3. So this is great. Second question is, when you're thinking about your foundation or your organization, are you currently participating in a cross-sector collaboration? This is a simple yes, no, or maybe you're not sure. But is your foundation or your organization currently participating in a cross-sector collaboration? It's starting to fill up pretty quickly on one side of the numbers here. All right, we're starting to get a couple folks that are saying no or not sure, but the majority, about 80% or so, are saying that that they are participating in a cross-sector collaboration. About 15% are not quite sure, which is certainly something else that I'm sure we'll be talking about later in this conversation. And then one person has said that they aren't. Well, one thing that we're hoping to talk about is what types of programs and what types of initiatives actually make sense for cross-sector collaboration, and when should your organization, and particularly from a philanthropic point of view, what is the role of philanthropy in helping to set the table for effective collaborations? Final question we have here is your foundation currently funding a cross-sector collaboration? Or if you're a nonprofit, are you currently receiving funding for a cross-sector collaboration? This will be interesting to see how it compares to the previous one, which is you may be working in it, but you may not be funded for it, or the foundation may be working in it, but not actually funding others within it. So we'll see how these numbers come up for just a few more seconds here. All right, so we're seeing similar numbers to the previous question, but a little smaller number. About 68% have said that they are funding or being funded. About 20% are saying no, which is interesting because most of the people are either for sure in this space or not sure, and then a couple are not sure. So thank you for that data. That's certainly helpful for us. It's helpful for PACE and certainly for our panelists, which is who I get to now introduce you to. And so we're thrilled to have 3 of our fellow alumni of our fellow program on this webinar. And so I'm actually going to introduce all 3 of them, and then we will start with asking a question to Allison Barman. So Allison Barman is the Vice President of Strategy and Learning at the Bush Foundation. And prior to joining Bush, she was a strategic consultant with McKinsey & Company and directed the Itasca project, which for many people who are familiar in this space is certainly a beacon of what cross-sector leadership can and has been very effective in being in solving challenges within particularly the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area. So thank you, Allison, for joining us. We also have Jennifer Odell, who's with the WK Kellogg Foundation, and she is a program officer with the Kellogg Foundation, particularly focusing on Educated Kids Division. She's actually been with the Kellogg Foundation for a number of years in a number of different positions. But prior to joining the foundation, she was the program manager of the Michigan Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, where she had many different roles, or her role actually supported a number of functions, which again required working with government, nonprofit, philanthropy, and others. And then we also have Christina Garcia, who is now a senior program officer at the Irvine Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, which is based out of California. I guess I should have mentioned the Kellogg Foundation, based out of Michigan. And so we have some good geographic diversity here as well. Christina joined the foundation, the Irvine Foundation, in 2015. Last year, prior to that, she was working in with the venture philanthropy fund REDF, and has had previous experience as well in multiple sectors. And so we're thrilled to have these three panelists. Allison was actually part of the inaugural Presidio Institute Fellows class, and then Jennifer and Christina were both part of this last year, and we actually have a number of other folks from philanthropy part of this year's cohort. And something that we'll mention towards the end is we'd love to have even more be part of next year's cohort, which should be opening application within the next month. So with that, Allison, my question for you is, or I guess my question for all of you, but is that I wanted to ask you, you all came from different sectors before your current roles. What were your perspectives or experience with cross-sector leadership when you originally entered philanthropy, and is anything different now? So we'll start with Allison, go to Jennifer, and then Christina.
Yeah, thank you, David and Kristen, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm really happy to be here talking about a topic which I love. So as David mentioned, before coming to the Bush Foundation, I had been directing a group called the Itasca Project for 6 years, and it's a group of CEOs and civic leaders working on social issues for our region. And so therefore, for those 5-6 years, I was very deeply immersed in cross-sector leadership, trying to work with business leaders on some of these social issues, and I loved that intersection. So then coming to philanthropy 3 years ago, I found it a little different because it is an option here in philanthropy to stay in our silo, right? Be a nonprofit foundation who funds just nonprofits, and that's not the kind of foundation we want to be, and that's not the kind of work we want to be. So I've been really trying to apply a lot of those practices about, like David talks about, building those teams and seeking that impact and solving problems in a cross-sector way.
Thank you. Jennifer, what was your experience before you originally entered philanthropy? Is anything different now?
So I started in the nonprofit sector, as you mentioned, and I can honestly say that I had, I think the nonprofit sector is often very insular, and then depending on the field and the size of your organization. So we were a really small organization. We only had 10 staff members. And so there was, while there was opportunities to kind of work with different sectors, we didn't get really deep into that work. And I didn't realize how important and impactful it was until I became a part of the Kellogg Foundation, and seeing how those different relationships and how that work can actually really impact and help nonprofits achieve their mission and goals. And I think the most important takeaway that I take from that is that there's a lot of really small grassroots organizations doing really, really great work that are very insular. And I think one of the things that philanthropy can do is to start to think about how to bring them into the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. And Christina?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm pretty new to philanthropy, so I don't know. I think my view of cross-sector leadership from a philanthropic perspective is still evolving and emerging. But while I'm new to the kind of sector of philanthropy, I'm not really new to being a grant maker, and so most of my career has been spent as a grant maker in national nonprofit intermediaries as well as state and local government. So for me, I see kind of a grant-making role across sectors. The way that I've done that work, I've always kind of been focused on working to effectively address a very specific problem while simultaneously trying to advance toward a scalable and sustainable solution. And so it's always required some level of cross-sector partnership and some amount of change in systems that kind of fund and deliver the solutions. So for me, I really think about, when I think about scale and sustainability and systems change, I don't think that those things can really be done or separated from a cross-sector approach. So for me, it's really a baseline philosophy of how you kind of affect improvement and change. And really, I think for now being in philanthropy, while there are still some similarities, I really see the positional power and role of philanthropy along with its discretion and ability to take risks as really different and creating kind of more unique opportunities to kind of do cross-sector work and have a broader influence.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a great perspective and certainly helpful to bring into the conversation. I know we now wanted to turn to some individual case studies or explorations and give each of our panelists a little time to talk about those. And I think they'll be bringing up their presentations. So Allison is going to go first. And then following these presentations, we're going to start to take questions and answers or questions. And so if you have questions while they're actually giving their presentations, feel free to write them into the chat box, but following the presentations, we'll get into some open conversation with the rest of the attendees. Allison.
Great, thanks. So before I get into a couple examples, I just wanted to give a quick background of the Bush Foundation. Who put the Bush in Bush Foundation is this man here. He was Archibald Bush and was an executive at the 3M Company in the early 1900s, made a whole lot of money, but left it in a private foundation for us to spend for the better of the community. We serve Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and the 23 Native nations that share that same geography. And this is our purpose statement, created within the last year, but it says to inspire and support creative problem solving within and across sector to make our region better for everyone. So you can see that within and across sectors is incorporated right into our purpose statement, and everything we do is meant to support that. And you know, why? Why do we care about this cross-sector approaches? And to me, this chart says it all. We're facing huge issues as a country, huge issues in our region, and how can we really solve those issues if we're just focused on this narrow, green slice of the pie? Some other interesting statistics, I once did a little math to say, what if we spent down our endowment at the Bush Foundation, how much government could we buy? And the answer was 8 days, 8 days of state government in our region. And then even if we just look at the impact we can have by funding nonprofits. In our region, nonprofits have an annual revenue of about $60 billion, and we granted $33 million last year. So even as one of the biggest funders in our region, we barely make a dent in that. So what we need to do as a philanthropy is thinking about leveraging each and every investment we make. One way to do that is by focusing on that green or that orange slice of the pie there and really use our funding to help government be more effective. Another way we can do that is to look at that blue, that 82% of business, and try to support businesses to think about social issues. That doesn't mean that we don't think that nonprofit piece is important and that we won't fund that. Of course we will. That work is absolutely critical. And I actually believe that not all issues can or should be solved by business and government. But if business and government can tackle the pieces that they can, then that can free up nonprofits and foundations to really focus on those areas where we can have a unique impact. And of course, realistically, the only way to move these issues forward is moving across those three sectors. So just a little bit about our program areas and how we've incorporated cross-sector approaches across different program areas. I think one of our best examples is our leadership program. We've had a fellowship where we invest in individuals for 50-some years. Archibald Bush himself actually started the fellowship program here at the Bush Foundation. And we have, since the very beginning, looked for leaders across the sectors. We've looked for leaders in business, in academia, in nonprofits, in government, and have funded those. Another programmatic example from us is our Community Innovation Program, and that's our biggest responsive open grant-making program. And one of the criteria to get a grant, these are project grants, but one of the key criteria we look at is whether the project is inclusive and collaborative. And that to us means, are the key people you need to solve the problem, are the key people engaged in this involved in the problem solving? And most times, if you look at who you need to solve the problem, it's very rarely one sector. Sometimes maybe it is, but you often need to have that cross-sector approach to really get to that. social business ventures, education by nature. Those are actually, sitting from a foundation trying to change other sectors. But one I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about is our Native Nation Building program, because I think that's a pretty unique example of applying a cross-sector approach. So our goal in Native Nation Building is to build models of tribal government that tribes around the world look to and how to exercise their self-determination for the good of their people. And before 2009, we funded various tribal programs in health, education, natural resources, economic development, social services. These were all really worthy projects, but the foundation asked, is there a way to make a bigger, longer-lasting difference? So we turned to tribal leaders and some of the research from Indian country and recognized that when it comes to overcoming some of the greatest challenges faced by tribes, progress is greatest when tribes exercise self-determination to create the foundations for stronger, sustainable governing institutions. Again, what makes the biggest difference in Indian country is when tribes exercise self-determination to create the foundations for stronger, sustainable governing institutions. So that's what we went after as a foundation, trying to support more sustainable governing institutions. And this was a fundamental shift. Instead of focusing on funding programs, we've been working on governance with them. These are the 23 Native nations in our region. And now here we are 7 years later. We no longer view these tribes as a collection of programs that we fund through programs of our choosing. Instead, consistent with self-determination, each tribe figures out what are their priorities, how are they going to work to improve their governance, and we figure out ways we can collaborate with them as 23 politically distinct, autonomous governance working through their elected leaders. And so this is my last slide on this. This was a really different approach for us as we went on this work. We really we have some key principles we follow: respect tribal autonomy and sovereignty. We collaborate through people who have been elected to lead their nations, and we recognize a partnership is essential to find common understanding. So again, this was different, and we've made certainly some enemies along the way because there used to be programs that could apply for grant and get the money or not, and now we're going out to the tribes and saying, let's work collaboratively to figure out, how you want to work, what it is we want to fund, and how we can find that common ground to support the effort to get more effective governance. I will stop there. So thanks for letting me share my story.
Thank you, Allison. And next up for the next story case study exploration is Jennifer. And if people do have questions on specific presentations, just hold them. As soon as all three panelists go, we'll have time for the Q&A.
So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me as part of this panel. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm just going to do a really quick overview of the Kellogg Foundation and then talk a little bit about some of my lessons learned in implementing some of the cross-sector strategies that Dave mentioned earlier. So at the Kellogg Foundation, we place children at the center of all we do. We focus all of our work on children ages birth to age 8. And our goals include educated kids, healthy kids, and secure families. We think those three things are foundational to the optimal child development. And we approach all of that work through a community and civic engagement lens as well as a racial equity lens. So we believe communities are the most important player in all of this work when we're talking about cross-sector partnerships. And so making sure that communities, families, and children are involved in all of this work is critically important. So I'm fortunate enough to have joined the Kellogg Foundation early enough in my career, and the foundation has a significant history in doing cross-sector leadership and cross-sector partnerships. And so I was able to join and really have a majority of my time spent on doing these works and doing this kind of work and learning lessons about this kind of work. And I think it's been really important in my trajectory in doing this work, and it just really played a critical foundation. And so over the years, one of the first bodies of work that I worked on was a multi-state effort that focused on building early childhood systems in 4 states across the country. And what we wanted to do, we kind of premised this entire initiative on the importance of cross-sector leadership. Now, 10 years ago, it wasn't called that, but that was really the premise of the work that we did, knowing that we needed key leaders from all 4 of those states to come to the table to do the work if we wanted to see sustained change around early childhood systems in those states. So we partnered with 4 different nonprofit organizations in those states, and we asked them to put together teams of 10 to 15 folks, all the key decision makers from any sector in the state that would help them to move an agenda for children. And so they brought those teams together. And through that process, our role as the funding entity was to provide them space. And so that's my first lesson learned, is that space and time is critically important. Cross-sector leadership, I think the foundation of it is relational, and it's about building relationships and building trust. And so providing folks with time and space to do the work is critically important. We would have teams of 10 to 15 leaders from a state who literally would not see each other for a year or 2 until they came to one of our convenings, and then they could actually talk. They did most of their work via email or by phone, but we actually provided the literal space for them to meet and come together. And I think that was one of the things that they thanked us for the most, is providing them that time and space. So don't underestimate space and time. I think the second lesson I learned is that it's critically important to level set power dynamics in the room immediately. So one of the things that we had to do is really talk to our partners and talk to our partners' partners and really say that we wanted to be a learning partner. We wanted to be a thought partner with them. We wanted to be in the room with them to learn about their work, to help to inform it, to think boldly and innovatively with them, and not be thought of as just the funder. So that's really important. I think that you have to do that often, you have to do that early, and you have to keep doing it constantly. And I would honestly say that this was a multi-year effort. We were with these partners for about 7 to 8 years, and it probably wasn't until year 2 or even into year 3 that they were kind of like, oh, they do really want to learn with us. They do really want to help us to achieve the goals that we're setting. And so that level setting around power dynamics is critically important. I think knowing and understanding the different sectors is critically important. That's another lesson learned for us. Knowing each sector, what their goals are, what they are being held accountable to, what's important for them, because those can all be very different conversations for each person that you're working with. And so really taking the time to set forth a vision that is relevant and makes sense to everybody in the room is another very critical step. I think one of the roles that philanthropy can play that's critically important is to actually fund innovation. So when you're working with different sectors, they all have different structures and systems in place that they have to operate within. There's a context that they operate within. And we can actually, as philanthropic institutions, kind of step back and provide them the resources, both monetary and otherwise, to be able to be bold and be courageous and be innovative and really think outside the box and do something that they would never be able to accomplish through their own context or their own sector. And I think lastly, one of the things one of the roles that I think philanthropy can play, so as I mentioned in our overall framework, that racial equity is something that's really important to us here at the Kellogg Foundation. It's a basis of all the work that we do. And our partners that we fund in community, that's also something that that they believe in and want to address as well. And so as a philanthropic institution, we have the ability to provide cover for those organizations that are doing work in community to talk about these issues in a real and authentic way. And so as we talk with our nonprofit partners and talk about racial equity, and they understand, and they might come to us and say, well, we get that, and we want to do this, but government can't do it because they say this. Or, this elected official won't even talk about race, and so how can we move a policy agenda when we can't get our elected officials to talk about race or to talk about inequities in the system? And as a foundation, when we convene folks and get them in the room together, that can become our issue. And so they don't damage relationships in community or create tension in community around the work that they're doing, because we've provided sort of a safe space for them to have those conversations. And I think philanthropy should always play that role. That's something that, our nonprofit partners have really expressed appreciation to us about. So that's really critical. And then, so lastly, just one more thing. I think I said lastly last time, but this is lastly. We have to be able, as philanthropic institutions, to be able to do cross-sector work internally as well as externally. And so while there might not be different sectors per se within foundations, there are certainly different ways that we work in our own silos. Allison sort of made mention to that earlier. We need to step out of those silos and really start to think about how we integrate and do our work differently internally as well, to be able to provide support to these different cross-sector partnerships and collaborations in community. So I guess I'll end there and turn it over to Christina.
Thank you, Christina.
All right. Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you, Kristen and Dave, for putting together the panel today. I mean, I think you've got three of us here that all could probably spend hours talking about cross-sector partnership, and I think one of the challenges of going last is that I'm so excited and want to talk so much more about the examples that Allison and Jennifer shared. So I'm going to try and stay focused so that we can really get into the Q&A. As I've been watching the Q&A feed, lots of really great questions that are kind of some of the hallmarks of the challenges of cross-sector work. Kind of continuing along this theme, for me, really it is kind of how can we use philanthropy's kind of more neutral convening power, and I think that's one of the clearest ways that philanthropy lives out a cross-sector approach. And you've already kind of heard both Allison and Jennifer share some examples on that. At Irvine, the James Irvine Foundation is California-based and California-focused. It was created during the Great Depression by Mr. James Irvine, and our mission is to improve the lives of Californians. So it is incredibly broad, which also kind of by nature casts a broad kind of cross-sector net. And so I think we've been fortunate to be have had an opportunity to do a lot of cross-sector work and have been relatively or kind of pretty successful in a variety of programmatic areas, kind of using our convening power combined with kind of investments in grant dollars to support cross-sector collaborations and build best practices across the state of California. I actually, when I joined Irvine, which was less than a year ago, I explicitly came to Irvine to do cross-sector work. And so I wanted to share a little bit about what I'm specifically kind of working on now, and also, like Jennifer, kind of identify some of those themes that I really saw kind of coming across in that work. So as part of my portfolio here at Irvine, I lead one initiative that's kind of testing a regional cross-sector approach that is with the intention of accelerating the scale of one of our major school reform efforts called Linked Learning. And Linked Learning is a career pathway model that combines rigorous academics, contextualized kind of career technical education, work-based learning, and student supports to increase student success. So the model itself is a cross-sector model. While it's rooted in the education sector, it requires active participation from business and industry, post-secondary institutions, as well as the community and nonprofits within the community that are providing support services. We've been investing and iterating in the design of this model for over a decade and have had a lot of successes demonstrating some key proof points of the model in terms of student success and improvements there. And we've also had some pretty significant policy wins. The California Career Pathways Trust is now funneling kind of billions of dollars into the state education system in order to scale career pathways, and it is a kind of clear mechanism that enables broader scale of linked learning. So as these things have happened, we really started thinking about how do we continue the scale. We had been working kind of district by district, really on the ground with our partners to really incubate this model and refine the model so that there's the right type of lessons and learning around how to really make this type of cross-sector model thrive and be successful on the ground. And so one of the things that we realize is that kind of scaling district by district across California as its own nation state was going to take a really long time, and we were looking for a way to accelerate the scale of linked learning more quickly, and recognized that in order to kind of create that demand, we needed to look beyond education, that working with kind of K through 12 districts, parents, and education advocates as champions was just not going to be sufficient to really try and get to that state level tipping point to really scale these career pathways. One of the things that we know about linked learning career pathways, which are similar to other career pathways that you all may be familiar with, it's kind of a California brand and is kind of a marker of kind of a platinum standard of career pathways. And so we know that career pathway work better prepares students for college and career, which makes them very attractive candidates to post-secondary institutions as well as employers. And we know that when working with post-secondary and with employers, they think regionally in terms of their recruitment efforts. They don't think at a district level. And so really our premise here is that, if we can ignite the interest of cross-sector partners for more linked learning graduates, we create an opportunity to elevate the scale and the adoption of linked learning at a regional level, and then help more students kind of get equitable access to these career pathways, which position them for greater success throughout their life. And this is the cross-sector scaling strategy that we're testing now through this regional hub initiative, and we're trying it out. So similar to what you heard from Allison and Jennifer, this is about kind of at a regional kind of community level, asking folks to come together in these hubs with anchor institutions and a lot of distributed leadership, bringing together the workforce systems, business and industry, K through 12 systems, as well as post-secondary education. So even within education, there are different interests in terms of post-secondary and high school, which operate very differently, have very different incentives, and need to work through that to really accelerate the scale. When I think about linked learning as an example of kind of this cross-sector mindset and approach, there are kind of a few themes that jump out, and I can keep this pretty quick because you've heard from Allison and Jennifer on quite a few of these already, so I was excited that I think we've got some clarity emerging around how you do this cross-sector work. And, the first piece is really having kind of a broad landscape view of the problem as well as the solution, but really recognizing the full ecosystem that's at play, influencing the problem as well as the solution. And at Irvine, we now kind of have an evolving focus. We want to kind of sharpen our focus on expanding economic and political opportunity for working families and young adults that are struggling with poverty. And so we're even taking our cross-sector experiences and lessons from our current work and folding those into our initiative design processes, reaching out and engaging cross-sector stakeholders to interview them to really inform our future initiatives. So really casting that net broadly. The second is convening and investing. As Jennifer was saying, this ability of philanthropy to hold a space and bring people together is critically important. And it's important that philanthropy take that responsibility seriously. And so I think for us, it's really about making sure that we're doing that well with the appropriate planning, the right type of facilitation, as well as follow through. One convening on its own is not going to be sufficient. So really looking at how how you kind of create a series of those, as well as funding the glue that helps all of those partners stick together and supports action, right? So this is process really with a purpose. The third thing for me is finding the Venn. I work with a lot of folks who come from the research world, and we're always talking about Venns and diagrams and 2x2s. But, you know, one of the biggest hurdles of cross-sector work really is the blame game. Sectors are kind of focused on pointing fingers and really focused on the differences and why things can't work cross-sector. And as much as possible, I think it's really important to try and stay focused on commonalities and where those interests align, and then leave the rest of those differences kind of at the door. They tend to be major roadblocks. So find out where folks can agree and really kind of focus on those things and leverage that. And then more and more as those relationships are strengthened, there's more willingness to kind of have some of those tough conversations and negotiate and really work towards finding common solutions. The fourth thing for me is staff capacity. And by staff capacity, I'm really talking about the capacity of program officers of philanthropy to understand cross-sector work. And Jennifer spoke to that a little bit as well. Even internally, how do we practice what we're preaching? We're institutions just like everyone else, so we're siloed as well. But I do think really thinking about how as program officers we're able to engage and understand the different sectors. I spend a lot of my time modeling and coaching to a cross-sector mindset, encouraging people to have patience, encouraging folks to find those commonalities and to be kind of brave and courageous to work through those tough conversations. Fifth, again, you've heard this already, but it is a learning mindset. A lot of cross-sector work, you know, this is where, you know, planning is critical, but plans are useless in a lot of ways, that you need to be prepared, but you also need to be prepared to learn as you go, particularly at the early stages of cross-sector partnership. You learn from the perspectives of the other partners and the other sectors. Again, what are their how are they being held accountable? What are their drivers? And listen to that, and that means that you may have to adapt the strategies that you're moving forward with. So really letting those partners lead the work. It's a lot of listening. And then lastly, it's time. And as I think we've all said, you know, partnership work and cross-sector work takes a lot of time, and building those relationships and trust, making meaning, establishing a common language, and really finding those mutual interests just take time. And it's a lot of upfront time, and I think philanthropy can sometimes want to move faster than that. So this, again, is one of those, you know, to go fast, go by yourself or go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And I think this is really important. It's a lot of upfront time, but as those partnerships coalesce, you do hit an acceleration that can be really valuable. I'll end there.
Well, thank you very much, Christina. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Allison. I know we're down to about 10 minutes left here, but we want to make some time for questions. If people have questions, you could certainly type them into the chat box, or I think at this point we're going to unmute and allow some people to be able to ask questions. If you're asking a question, please include your name and your organization, and then hopefully we'll be able to capture that. And then the last thing I'd say is we also do have a resident expert on cross-sector leadership here joining us right now with Allison Gold, who is the manager of leadership education here at the Presidio Institute, and she's actually helped set up this entire panel. While you can't see her face up here, her fingerprints are all over everything that we've been talking about, and she certainly could be someone who could follow up with deeper answers to some of the questions that we're not able to cover. I'm going to kick it off with one question here, and then we can open it up to anyone else in the chat. But a couple of things that were referenced in the chat box have been this element of conflict or tension. If enemies are made, can you talk more about the enemies that are made and the tension between groups if you're working with autonomous groups? And specifically, there was a question around conflicts between sectors. If a nonprofit proposes something that actually could threaten a business, how does that play out? And with a limited time, if one or more panelists want to kind of grab that with a quick response, that would be great.
I mean, I will say quickly, I think this is exactly about relationships, right? Because that is very true. There can be conflicts, but I think investing the time and giving the space that everybody's talked to building those relationships helps work through them. And I think it is very true. Sometimes nonprofits, think and business think it's going to be, they'll have opposing viewpoints. But I think when you have those relationships and you have the time and space and the capacity and all these things we're talking about to work through it, you can find the places where that Venn diagram. Michael Porter from HBS does some great work on shared value, and we shouldn't be thinking like one loses and the other wins, because there is plenty of space for shared value among multiple sectors.
Any other responses from the panelists? All right, a quick follow-up on the relationship piece. And well, I guess let's first turn, anybody can unmute themselves. If you unmute yourself from the top of the screen, does somebody have a question that they want to offer by voice? All right, I'm going to grab another one of these questions. If you do, feel free to chime in. But one of the other questions, and actually it builds off the relationship piece that somebody had mentioned here, which is, there's a lot of interest here in dialogue, in space, and time. How do you make this? How do you ultimately ensure that this is not just all talk and no action, but it actually leads to creating some impact in the community?
I would really say I think this is about the structure of that you set up and how you set the table for bringing people together. So at the very beginning, I think it's most important that you're establishing a clear goal, and in a way, kind of setting a timeline as an ambition. There have been times where you have to kind of adjust that timeline once you get into things, but I think laying out a clear process and engagement strategy that you can share with the cross-sector partners to get to action is really important. I think that's also where facilitation and the kind of staffing in between those convenings is critically important. So you really need to have a facilitator in the room that's continuing to help advance that momentum and is doing the work in between. The other thing for me, I would say, is that, if you're going to engage the private sector, business and industry, you're not going to get them to stay at the table very long if there isn't clear action. And so for me, that's actually one of the benefits of doing cross-sector with business and with employers, is that there's an impatience based on their business model that can actually be catalytic and really kind of help push public systems and nonprofits.
Thank you, Christina. Anybody else on the phone have a question they want to chime in with? Or else I'll take one more online. Thought I just heard somebody unmute themselves. All right, well, here's one other question, which is around power dynamics. And certainly something that's interesting to think about when you're talking about philanthropy's role in this. How do we make sure that money doesn't completely equate to power? From a business perspective, from a philanthropy perspective, who's sitting at the table, who has the purse strings? Can you tell us more about that experience, either in philanthropy or your previous experience outside?
So I don't know that I have an answer to that, but like I said earlier, I think that addressing that dynamic early and often is critical. To some degree, there's always going to be some level of power dynamics that are happening in the room among all the different sectors. So you can't eliminate them. It's not an elimination strategy necessarily, but just to try to constantly put them out on the table and make sure that folks are talking about it. You have to do it. You have to do it early and often. You have to do it individually and collectively with a group. There's just multiple ways. It's just constant. It's a dosage issue, right? You just constantly have to keep talking about it. And like I said earlier, it can take years for that to finally kind of make sense to folks, because and I know from experience working at a nonprofit for so long, they're the funder. They're the funder, and if they're in the room, it creates a level of tension, and things get heightened, and you just have to keep showing up, and you have to keep building that relationship, and you have to keep building trust. you have to do things that might be not so philanthropic, like not be prescriptive and actually allow people to make decisions and let that happen while you take a back seat. So those types of things, you have to do and do them early, often individually, collectively, and just keep at it constantly, I think.
Yeah, Jennifer, I really agree with that. And, we just ask for a ton of feedback from our grantees too, right? We're constantly surveying them and asking them questions and getting that feedback. And then I think it's, when we're still working on this, then demonstrating that humility, acknowledging when we're, that we are learning and we need to change sometimes based on what we're hearing. And yeah, I mean, really, really taking that feedback seriously, I think, is important.
Thank you. Well, I realize we're getting close to the end of time here, so I want to turn it back over to Kristen. Allison did actually enter her information here. Allison Gold entered her information, so if people have continuing questions that you'd love or be interested in the Presidio Institute responding to, feel free to look there. We also put some information about some upcoming events, including the next time the fellows are getting together. But Kristen, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, well, thank you guys all so much for sharing your insightful thoughts, your experiences, and really being honest about some of your challenges. So we really appreciate that. I'd love to just send us off with a quick call to action, and if maybe each of you could spend 15 seconds telling us what's one thing that you hope that philanthropy can be more thoughtful or intentional about when thinking about how they engage with government, business, academia, nonprofits, or others.
I mean, I think one helpful thing we've done is incorporate it into our criteria, right? So you're looking for it, really looking for it.
I think
Jennifer?
philanthropy needs to act with a little bit more urgency. We have a tendency to kind of talk a lot, and maybe step up and act a little bit more urgently to address some of the urgent issues that communities are facing.
Hear, hear.
I also think philanthropy can do a better job understanding the interdependencies of our work, right? We often can play more of an R&D role and then look to government to scale. And there's a clear kind of cross-sector partnership and relationship there. So being more attentive to the impact that our work has on the broader systems, I think, is really important.
Great. Well, thank you all. Allison, Jennifer, Christina, thank you for being part of this. Dave and Allison, thank you to you and your team. Again, we'll make the video of this webinar and the chat transcript available on our website, and we are going to do another one of these in May. So when you close out of the webinar today, you should get a really quick survey. Speaking of feedback, to Allison's point, a super quick survey about today's experience, and also an opportunity to suggest topics that you'd like to see PACE take on in webinars in the future. So with that, I will adjourn this webinar and thank all of our speakers and all of our attendees for being here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.